Welcome to A Way Forward, the podcast where I sit down and have real discussions about the challenges we face in our cities, communities, and neighborhoods. The goal of this podcast is to create a space that includes expert interviews, guests with lived experiences, and voices not often heard. I'm your host, retired Police Chief Daniel Hahn, and I will bring my experience in law enforcement, community, and education to each conversation so that together we can build a way forward. Okay, so today I have Mr. Xavier Becerra, and I'm not going to say all of your kind of resume because we'd be here all day, first of all. But I do want to note a few things that you have, for a long time now, served not only your community, but your state and nationally, our country. You've given many, many years of service serving as state assemblyman, Attorney General for the state of California, and most recently, the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, and much more that maybe we'll cover here in a second. But thank you, first of all, for coming on and talking about your journey and some things to come and how we can be better, in this case, as a state. So I want to start with, you have a tremendous story. One could say really encapsulates many dreams of people in our country, families, and in California specifically. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about your parents and your upbringing, and what about that experience creates the core of what you believe today.
So first, Chief, I got to say thanks for having me on. I'm a fan. I've always been a fan.
I need as many of those as I can get.
Well, you got one, and you had him before you started your podcast and before you became chief in Sacramento. I'm thrilled that you're doing this, and I'm glad you're in the public eye because we need leaders. And so I just have to say that because I'm a fan.
Thank you.
My parents' story is, the proverbial. They came with $12 in their pocket from Mexico to start their life here. My mom came from Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. My dad was actually born in the U.S., but he grew up in Mexico.
Okay.
Because he was born in 1928. Depression started hitting. My grandfather said, hey, if it's tough for an American to get a job, can you imagine what it's like for a Mexican?
Yeah, that's right in the middle of the Great Depression.
Yeah, so he said, I'm taking the family back to Mexico, see if we can make it work. My dad, early on, had to leave school after 6th grade to start working. He was the oldest of 8. So he went up and down the state of California, working, farm working, and all the rest. Again, the proverbial story. Marries my mom, brings her to California, to Sacramento. My 3 sisters and I were born and raised here. McClatchy graduate. First in my family to have a chance to go to a university and graduate. My parents, my dad was mostly a construction worker, my mom a clerical worker. Nothing big. I thought I was middle class until the day my mom and I was driving my mom to Stanford University to start my first day at Stanford, where I got accepted. And we go through Palo Alto, and I'm looking around, I'm thinking, hey, I guess I'm not middle class. I guess I'm not middle class yet. But I felt like I was, in heaven. Didn't have a lot, but never did without.
Right.
Ate good meals all the time. My mom's a great cook, and everything went well. And I've been very fortunate. I consider myself blessed. I now have 3 daughters who are now adults, doing well. My wife is a physician. It's a blessed life.
So I would guess the dreams of your mom and dad kind of came true with you and your sisters, right? They wanted a better life, I'm sure, and that their kids are all very successful.
No doubt. My parents were able to retire in dignity. My dad has passed. 2020, he passed, and my mom lives with my wife and me. My 3 sisters and I have been able to, do fairly decently in life. It's all good, and this country did fulfill the dream for my parents, and certainly for us.
And if I heard correctly, did you say your dad had a 6th grade education?
Yes.
And now he has kids all with college degrees and Attorney General, and that's pretty amazing on behalf of your parents.
I tell folks, I look back one generation to my parents who never had a chance to step into a college classroom, one generation forward to my daughters, and went to some of the best universities in the world, night and day.
Yeah.
But that's what America does for you. That's what California does for you.
Which is kind of pertinent today, and we'll probably get into this in a little bit, but the whole issue on immigration right now, regardless of what side you fall on that, your story is a story of immigration and the impact that parents that are seeking a better life for their family can do, and as you said, in one generation.
Yeah, I look at immigration not just as a former member of Congress who for 24 years tried to pass comprehensive immigration reform, or as the Attorney General of California who actually filed suit against the Trump administration his first term to stop him from doing some of his immigration stuff in California that was unconstitutional, or as the Secretary of HHS more recently, where we actually did things like expanded access to healthcare through Obamacare for dreamers.
Right.
That's immigration from the lens of the work I got to do as a public servant. But for me, immigration is personal.
Right.
Obviously, as a son of immigrants, having watched how hardworking immigrants build this country, that's why one of my themes in my campaign for governor is build. We got to build. We're going to build our way out of this affordability crisis. And for me, that's personal because I grew up watching my dad build.
Yeah. And I actually forgot to mention that at the very beginning. Probably the most important thing right now is you are running for governor of the state of California.
Yes, I
am. So we'll get into that too. But it took you a while to mention this, but you mentioned you went to college. At first you didn't mention which college, and eventually you did. But, just to be clear, you went to Stanford, which is not, just any old college. It's got a huge reputation, and especially to me, thinking your dad has a sixth grade education and his son goes to Stanford University is pretty amazing. I believe you were the first in your family to graduate from college. Is that correct?
I want to make this clear because I think it's important to recognize my oldest sister who graduated from community college.
Right.
I was the first in the family to graduate from a 4-year university, but she, that being older, started college before I did.
Got it.
And I want to give her all that due credit.
So that's great. So I'll say you and your sister as
Yes.
being the first in your family to graduate from college. And, as somebody that teaches in college and has been to college, I have met countless people who are the first in their family
Yes.
to go to college. Mm-hmm. And these are people whose families their parents immigrated here, but also people whose families have lived here for generations.
Exactly.
And they're the first in their family to go to college. And it's always such a point of pride of not only them, but their parents. If you see them at graduation, their parents are like losing their minds.
Oh, yeah.
So as somebody who you and your sister were the first in your family to go to college and graduate from college, what do you think is the significance of the first in the family to go to college, and how can California support that?
Yeah, you break the barrier, right? You give everyone this hope that they can pass through that door now as well. And that's the beauty of what this country has done for so many families over the decades and centuries. Is it really does give you that dream that, hey, they could do it, I could do it too. And there's two things that I think are really important about being the first. One, it shows you what your family can help you accomplish, and because you don't do it yourself. And that's amazing that a guy with a sixth grade education who would come home dirty and sometimes bloody every day from construction work, outdoor road construction work, and a mom who was working clerical work, then coming back and doing all the home stuff, they could make sure their kids got better. But the other part that I think is very significant, and Chief, I think you'll recognize, because you were chief of the police department in Sacramento. I've had a chance to be in public service at high levels as well. We were given a chance. I'm a affirmative action baby. I will admit it right now. I got into Stanford University. You mentioned a great university. I wasn't the valedictorian. I wasn't the star athlete. But someone said, this kid's showing some promise.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they gave me a chance. I had good grades, so I could qualify. But clearly, there were people who had resumes better than mine at that age. And I think we have to give our country credit that it said, hey, let's try to give some of these families that have never had this opportunity a chance to prove themselves. And you and I demonstrated this country made a good bet on the Sacramento Chief of Police and the AG or Secretary or whatever you want to say, Congressman. And so I think that's the beauty of it. Your family push, but also your country push.
Yeah. You mentioned your father's sixth grade education. You going to Stanford, your sister going to college, and your other sisters your kids going to college, is amazing. But the other thing that was going on, you say 1929. In our country during the Great Depression, there was a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment and Mexican repatriation, and so not only working in the fields and sixth grade education, but your parents surely had to deal with a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment here in California.
Chief, my dad would tell me as a young man, he would see the signs outside establishments that said, "No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans allowed." Yeah. So that was still the experience of people in those days. At the same time, that same society gave that man and that woman a chance to let their kids go to Stanford University.
Yeah, because it's not everybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he still came here, and he put up with those things and fought those things to benefit you and your family. So as we mentioned this, or I mentioned this too. I asked you this earlier today, but as somebody that has had a very, very, very distinguished career, I don't know anybody other than you that can say they were a congressman, they were a state assemblyman, they were attorney general, and they're a U.S. health secretary. I don't know if there's anybody else that can claim all those titles. So that's a pretty illustrious career. And some might say, hey, it's a good time to go sit around on the beach and enjoy life and enjoy my family and try to kind of relax. And, there's not too many more things I can put on my resume that is bigger than what's already on there. And yet you have recently, in the last several months, decided to run for governor of the largest, most prosperous state in our country, California. So why in the heck would you want to do that?
And I get asked that lots of times, including from some folks in my family. I got the energy. I want to give back. My state has, we just finished talking about all the things that my state made possible for my parents and for my sisters and now my family. And I've got something to give. And I've learned a lot. When you become a Congress member, you learn how to do policy. And I did it for 24 years in Congress, and some of the biggest measures. I was one of the original drafters of the Affordable Care Act. Then when you get a chance to be the Attorney General of the largest state and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which, by the way, is probably the largest health agency in the world and one of the largest public entities, public enterprises in the world. So when you're CEO of some of the largest public enterprises, you learn how to get things done. You don't get to just pontificate as you do when you're a congressman. You get to think about policy and hope that it passes. No, when you're an executive, when you're a CEO, especially of an enterprise the size of the Department of Health and Human Services, you got to deliver. And I came in, I became secretary of HHS right in the midst of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic in March of 2021. And so we
Which is the biggest thing in our lifetimes, health-wise, at least in my lifetime.
We had thousands. Remember, essentially, when Joe Biden became president in January 2021, 10 jumbo jets filled with Americans crashed and killed everyone on board. Except it weren't jumbo jets. It was called COVID. Right. And some 4,100 Americans died the day Joe Biden took over the keys at the White House. And so it was a pandemic. And so we had to deliver. And essentially what the president said is, go save lives. Figure out how to go save lives. And you got to deliver. And fortunately, we were given the tools to deliver. And when you get to do things like that, by the way, most folks don't realize the Department of Health and Human Services, its budget, you think the Department of Defense's budget is big? HHS's budget is twice as big as the Department of Defense. Yeah. Actually, my budget at the Department of Health and Human Services was, since I'm not there anymore, was 5 times bigger than the budget of the state of California.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that included, same as all your other positions, the requirement of collaborating with a lot of different opinions and across the aisle and all those sort of things to get stuff that large done.
Absolutely. You're in front of Congress, oversight committees, appropriations committees. You're talking to governors from every state and local officials, health departments, and communities. I mean, we didn't look at you as a red or blue state when it came to COVID and trying to help you get through. We looked at you as a state that had a lot of people that needed to be saved.
And I think a lot of times now that we know a lot more about COVID, but at the beginning, there was a lot of fear and not a lot of knowledge about anything at the very beginning, right before we started understanding more. So, we mentioned California, and you running for California, and California being the largest, most prosperous state in the country and has been for a long, long time. And although we are all those things, it doesn't mean that California, that we don't have our issues, right? And so a two-part question. One, how do you think California is doing right now? And what do you think are the biggest issues facing California that you would like to address as governor?
And that's a great question, Chief,
because you know, when I go around the country, there's people that don't like California at all. Like, oh, you're from California, then they give you a dirty look. And yet California is still the most prosperous state. It's not going anywhere, and it still delivers on so many things.
Yeah, people have been preaching the demise of California for years and years, and yet we just went from the 5th largest economy in the world to the 4th largest economy in the world. And so that's the sort of the two faces of California. We are a prosperous state. The problem is the prosperity is not reaching all families. And here's the way I would put it. Can a Manuel and Maria Teresa Becerra today, that construction worker and that clerical worker, hope to buy a house, send their kids to good colleges, and then at the end of all of that, retire in dignity? I don't know how many construction worker and clerical workers today believe that they can do those things. That's what my parents did. And those are the parents that started with $12 in their pocket when they came.
Right.
But yet somehow they figured out how to save enough money to buy a house. All 4 of us either went to college or the military. And now they've retired in dignity. My dad has passed, but my mom is, living well, and she's living with us. I want every construction worker and clerical worker. I want every police officer, every firefighter, every teacher, everyone who works, I believe, deserves to be able to say what my parents said, that they gave their kids a better life. And we got to fight for that, because today, as prosperous as California is, I guarantee you many families, especially those working families, are saying, I don't know how we're going to get that done. And it's up to us to, as I say, build our way out of this affordability crisis.
Yeah, it's very interesting you've said that, and I've heard you mention affordability several times. But I was thinking, I've thought often, because I have 2 daughters that are both in college, and I think about this probably every day to a certain extent. I think back of when I was 19 years old and went through the police academy, and the things I was able to do on that salary of a community service officer, and when I turned 21, becoming a police officer. I bought my first condo, then I bought my first house on a young, low-level officer's salary, because I was brand new, so I hadn't had many of the raises yet. And my oldest daughter wants to be an elementary school teacher. So I often think, like, if I had repeated my life right now, could I have bought that house, that condo, as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old police officer? And I think the answer is probably no. And so I often worry about my daughters, and my one that wants to be a teacher. She actually says, I'm not going to make very much money. And I'm like, yes, you are. You're going to be a teacher. And so she loves the idea of being a teacher, and she's going to be a junior in college to be that. But I worry, like, is she going to be able to buy a house? Is she going to be able to afford the things that I could afford? As a matter of fact, my wife and I continue to put money away in investment accounts and things like that, because we've said we're going to have to help our daughters buy their first house, unlike me. And so What do you think needs to be done for the very thing you just mentioned about affordability and people with the jobs that really keep our state going? Teachers, police officers, construction workers. How are those folks, how can we help as a state? How can we help them be able to do the things that your parents did and that I did?
So, Chief, you just wrapped up in your question so much. First, you've made it clear. Family is the anchor to just about everything. If your girls are going to be able to afford that home, it's probably because you're going to step up, you and your wife will step up and help them in some way. That's what family does. But you have to have family that's capable,
Right.
is equipped to do that. My parents could not have done that for me when they were, construction worker, clerical worker. We were just fortunate. They did what they needed to. They got us to college.
They got you the ability to do it yourself.
Yeah, they got us into the military, got us into college, and then from there we built up. But that's so important. The second thing is you just pointed out, you don't know if today, starting out as that 21-year-old, 22-year-old, you could have bought the house, that condo the way you did previously a few decades ago.
Right.
That's what's concerning is that this state is still very prosperous, but too many families are exactly where you just said. So what do we do? As I said, one of the things is we have to, as I said, build our way out of this affordability crisis. One of the things that means to me is we got to do more to make housing more available. When you have such a small supply, a tight supply of something, and demand is high, well, that's going to drive up the cost of what supply is available. And that makes it unaffordable. And so that means we got to build more housing. Fortunately, the legislature and the governor today are taking actions that will make that more possible. But here's what I will tell you. For those public servants, for people who do things, they're sacrificing some salary. Your daughter as a kindergarten or elementary school teacher, you as a budding police officer, we should do more to help those who want to go into public service. And so we should have programs where the state helps subsidize the ability to purchase. So working with your family who helps you purchase, we make it more possible for you to get into that first condo.
Would that be like lower interest rates or any number of things?
We subsidize it. We offer you help in the down payment. There are programs that we can bolster that make it possible for someone who makes a commitment to public service to then be able to get into a home. And from my perspective, that home should be close to work, because there are places, even in Sacramento now, I used to be in LA where I lived a long time, the only place you could buy was about 40 miles from where you work.
Right.
And the commute, the bear of a commute you'd face, you're losing all this time that you should be spending with family. So not just buy a house, but buy a house close to where you work.
Right. Good. Yeah, my wife is a school teacher too, and her commute is about 5 minutes. So it's real. It is very nice. Mine was never quite 5 minutes, but California is not unlike other states in our nation. We have challenges and all sorts of things going on, but healthcare, Medicare, Medi-Cal are two health programs that impact California. And in my opinion, nobody should go without medical insurance. Amen. I mean, stuff is just so expensive and you just never know what can happen to you or your kids or something. And to add the stress of thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of cost is just, I don't think somebody in our country, a country of our wealth, should ever have to face. But I think there's a lot of people that are concerned about that right now, and are concerned whether they can either maintain health insurance or get health insurance in the first place. And these things cover so many things like prescription meds, behavioral health, nursing care, maternal health, which is so critical, and community-based services for people with developmental disabilities. What do you think needs to be done, especially as the potential next governor, that can be done to ensure that people are able to get the health care and services that we all just so desperately need?
First, I think we have to take your position, at least your attitude, and say healthcare should not be a privilege. It should be a right. That we're not going to deprive anybody, certainly not someone who's working in California, a right to access the health care that they need. No one who works should have to fear taking their child to the hospital because they may not be able to make the mortgage payment or the rent payment. That is not peace of mind. And so, first and foremost, we have to continue on this trajectory. And here I want to give the governor and our legislature due credit that they are pushing to get California to the point where no family has to worry that they'll have access to the care that they or their children need. That's the first thing. So quite honestly, I will tell you, given what we're seeing happen in Washington, D.C. with this reconciliation bill that just became law that's going to actually kick people off of their health care in California and throughout the country, that's going to make it more expensive to keep the health insurance, that's going in the opposite direction. But if I'm governor, we're not going backwards, because we have to make it so that everyone can have access to that care they need, not just for the peace of mind it gives a family. But think about it this way, Chief. If you're that hospital, especially if you're a hospital in a rural part of California where it's really tough to make a go of it, if you're a hospital and all of a sudden a good portion of the people that are coming to your hospital are no longer coming with Medi-Cal or Medicare or their own health insurance through the Affordable Care Act or just their own insurance, they're still coming to the hospital.
Right.
Except now they don't come with payment.
Right.
Because they can't afford to stay without insurance. And
the hospital's still going to serve them.
The hospital still is required to give them service. So guess what happens? Either those hospitals go under, and that's why you're hearing today, as a result of the Washington reconciliation bill that the President Trump sought and got, a lot of rural health facilities are now in danger because they no longer will have as many paying customers, and they're going to have to absorb that. Either that, or they pass along the cost of those uninsured to those people who are insured. So the hospitals charge the insurance companies more, and the insurance companies then charge you as their customers more to keep your insurance. So one way or the other, we're going to give people care. The worst thing we can do is make it care that the hospitals and doctors are going to offer it don't get paid for. And because people can't afford it, they wait till the last moment, which means they use the emergency room, which is the most expensive form of healthcare you can get. And again, we end up paying for it.
Not only the most expensive, but probably not the most effective on all things.
Just because you're coming late.
Yeah, yeah. So in regards to that same thing, I think it's Medicaid that, there's in the new budget or talks at the federal level of cuts to that, which funds a lot of what is provided in California.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned you had sued Trump in his first term numerous times, but so what is the impact if those cuts do come to fruition to Medicaid in California, and what can be done about it to ensure that people are still able to get the medical care that they so desperately need often?
Wow, the projections are that more than 12 million Americans are going to lose their health insurance coverage from this bill. Obviously, a lot of those folks are
including California.
From California, for sure, no doubt. And what that means is it's going to be a bigger tax on those families to access care that they now will have to pay out of pocket. And it's going to be a big tax on those providers of care who are now going to have to service people who can't afford to pay the full bill because they no longer have their insurance coverage. So it'll be devastating to a lot of families, and it's certainly not going to make it easier for the state to handle its budget and for the health sector, hospitals, doctors, nursing homes to be able to manage. It's not a good thing. When one of the goals that I had as Secretary of Health and Human Services was to make sure that more Americans had access to the health care they needed than when I started. And fortunately, we achieved that. In fact, we achieved a record number of Americans who had health care under our service. And by the time I left office, January of 2025 this year, more than 300 million Americans had access to that hospital for their kids because they had their own health insurance. Never had this country seen that number of Americans have their own health insurance coverage. Well, the bill that passed recently in Congress is going to lower the number of those Americans who have their own health insurance coverage. And so we're going in the opposite direction. Obamacare, which, by the way, I helped write and pass when I was in Congress, and then as AG, I actually ended up defending the Affordable Care Act all the way to the Supreme Court as the Attorney General for California, and we won. We defended it. Then as Secretary, I had a chance to send it to record levels. Right. When Trump was in office, he left. There were about 12 million people who had their health insurance through the marketplaces. By the time we left, we had doubled that to 24, almost 24.5 million people.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, a couple takeaways. So just let me know if I'm accurate. So one, cost is going to go up for people who are already in a state where affordability is an issue.
Yes, yes.
People are still going to, in emergency situations at the very least, people are still going to go to the hospital.
Undoubtedly.
Right? So they're still, and the hospital is not going to turn people away. They're going to give the care. So somebody's footing that bill.
Yes.
And lastly, I would imagine one of the concerns would be is people don't always go to the hospital prior to becoming an emergency situation, therefore ensuring that at some point it will become an emergency situation. It could be maternal care, could be all sorts of things that it's critical that they get ongoing care for that maybe they don't go to the hospital if they're not insured.
Yeah.
Would that
Yeah,
be...
you now have brought me to the point where I always point out what two great Americans have said when it comes to healthcare, but it applies across the board. One of those great Americans said, "Mijo, es mejor prevenir que remediar." My son, my mom is that great American. She said, "Son, it is always better to prevent than to try to remedy." The second great American lived 150, 60 years before my mom said it, and Frederick Douglass said, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men."
Amen.
We're spending money in healthcare repairing a whole bunch of broken men and women when we should be spending a lot of money to build strong children. And when you don't allow a family to take that child to the hospital because you can't afford it yet and you think your kid can get better, you're not building a strong child. You're waiting till that child or that young adult is broken. Right. And that's when it costs us a ton of money. And so it's penny wise to cut health care at the federal level, and it would be penny wise for the next governor to cut health care at the state level.
And not just physical health, but mental health, as we saw during COVID.
Undoubtedly.
Mental health, especially amongst youth,
Undoubtedly.
spiked. And we saw a lot of that even here.
We started
Sacramento.
988 when I was Secretary of HHS, a nationwide program where, just like 911 for emergencies, today if you dial 988 or if you text 988, and actually you can do it through chats as well, if you go to 988, you can actually speak to someone if you're suffering from a mental health crisis.
Which is great, especially if it gets known as well as 911, because we saw a lot of that even just here in Sacramento of young people, from suicide to other things, just because, their whole world changed. And they're already in a challenging time.
Yeah.
Of being.
And Chief, and you'll know this because you were the chief at Sacramento, 911 means you're likely going to dispatch a cruiser, officers to the scene, oftentimes for someone who may be going through a mental health crisis. And sometimes when you're going through a mental health crisis, you're not stable.
Right.
And sometimes those situations turn ugly. And oftentimes officers who are trained to deal with force often find themselves in a situation where they have to use their training. When in fact, even officers will tell you, and you know this, you shouldn't be sending an officer, you should be sending a mental health expert. Right. And that's what 988 now lets us do, is instead of calling 911 and dispatching a cruiser, you can call 988 and dispatch mental health professionals.
Which I've always, it's always resonated with me what I've heard from people in the mental health field, that a lot of suicides are, if you can get them through that moment, it will never happen again.
That's right.
So it's so critical that in that moment, people get the services, because if you get them through that, because just through work, I've seen people try to attempt suicide and aren't successful, and even physically they're injured for the rest of their life, and they never attempt it again.
Yeah.
It's so, the experts always say, if you can get them through that moment, that one moment of weakness, then it might never happen again, which is so critical for a number like that.
988.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question about criminal justice, police departments, and as what is often referred to as the top cop, the Attorney General.
Yes.
I will never ever be able to repay you for what you did for our city and our police department, which I still don't know why you did it. I never saw a personal benefit for you of taking on basically a third-party investigative role of a very tragic, controversial shooting that we had here in Sacramento, Stephon Clark. But so you are very well versed in all things criminal justice. And it's always at the forefront. If you take polls, whether they're political polls or just community sentiment polls, criminal justice is always near the top, if not number one. Even when people in the middle of protests and things, criminal justice safety is on the top of people's mind, no matter where you go. And many people, especially in urban areas in California, are concerned about their safety. They feel like crime is rising, even sometimes when it's not, but they feel like it is. As governor, what do you think should be the priorities of public safety regarding safety in our communities around the state?
First and foremost, trust. There is no way you can heighten neighborhood safety if families, those who are the public servants, don't work together and trust each other. If I can't trust the officers on the beat, those officers are not in good shape, and we're not in good shape. If officers can't trust that the community will help them try to keep the community safe, they'll never be able to do the best job, because they're not everywhere, and they need the eyes and ears and cooperation. So trust is the most important thing. I will say...
And that's been a challenge forever. Really.
Forever. And in fact, I think what we're seeing happen now with these ICE raids and so forth is diminishing trust.
Absolutely.
And I think that the worst thing is that our peace officers, our police officers, our sheriff's deputies are caught in the middle, because now they're being asked to sort of manage both sides. And it's tough. It's tough.
Well, and the community doesn't really distinguish between an ICE officer and a local police department that serves their specific community.
And that's where all the work that's been done, that you did, we did, to try to build trust among communities and law enforcement, is being eroded by what the federal law enforcement agencies, at least we think they're law enforcement agencies. We can't tell because they're all masked up. Sometimes they don't even identify themselves. We assume they're federal law enforcement agencies, what they're doing, which I think is a total disregard for the efforts of public safety by our law enforcement agencies. And so I think that makes it tough. But trust, I would say, is the most important thing. Safety flows from that. If you're trusting each other, if I'm helping my local cops on the beat patrol, I say, hey, you know what? I saw something kind of strange. Right. I'm helping advance safety. And so safety is what we're all looking for, but you have to have first the trust, accountability. You and I know this. You just talked about the Stephon Clark incident, the tragic incident. You have to make sure there's accountability. And you have to have a transparent process that lets you believe that there will be accountability when it's called for. And I would say that at the end of the day, it all also is wrapped up by what I would call partnership. It goes back to the trust element. You meaning law enforcement, need us, the community. They, meaning the community, need us, law enforcement, to do it right. And so trust, safety, accountability, partnership. We do those things well, we're going to thrive. We're going to thrive because people will trust that they can then go to work and be safe and not carjacked. They can trust that their kids can walk home from school and they can, thrive. Trust.
Two things you mentioned bring something up in my mind. One is, regardless of what you're what you're trying to do, in this case, immigration with ICE and all that, the process is important. Like, we could even disagree on what the actual end goal is, but the process is critically important that builds that transparency and that trust. And then secondly, I've often wondered, as this discussion rages on about being masked up, the federal agents being masked up, and I ask, I know the answer, but I ask myself all the time, what if the local law enforcement officers put masks on? And I know what the answer would be. Right. It wouldn't be good. And it wouldn't be accepted. And it would, in Sacramento at least, there would be protests over it. So I always wow, all these guys are masked up. We wouldn't be able to do that at the local level.
Chief, there is not a law enforcement agency in California. I think out of the AG position for more than 4 years, a little bit more than 4 years. But I think I can say still with great confidence that there is not a law enforcement agency in California that would conduct its law enforcement affairs the way the federal government, ICE, is conducting its
Right.
law enforcement activities. Their tactics, their practices are things that not just the communities in California wouldn't tolerate, our law enforcement agencies in California wouldn't tolerate.
Which is why I say, like, people can debate what they're trying to accomplish, right? You know, with immigration enforcement. But I think a lot of times the bigger debates is how they're actually going about doing it, the process of which they're taking, the mass, the force they show, whatever it might be, is what ends up being a lot of the more controversial things. Again, it's about the process. How transparent are we? How that way we do things.
And we had a chance, when I was AG, we had a chance to work on use of force.
Yeah.
What is appropriate
Absolutely.
use of force? You were still chief. We had a chance to work on how you deal with racial profiling. We had a chance to deal with rogue officers. And we had a chance to deal with, remember, in those days, it was still pretty new to use cameras.
It was brand new.
Yeah, and so how you go about instituting all that. And you give California credit, give law enforcement in California credit. We have tried to stay up with the times, and we have tried to use the best practices. I can say this with confidence, having worked at the national level and having served as Attorney General, there is no state that does a better job of trying to keep law enforcement up to par with where we should be with our standards. And here, I just, again, a tip of the hat to the women and men in uniform who often don't get the credit. We only talk about the bad actions, but every day someone's doing something good because we employ better practices and we have better trained personnel, and so we try to do it best. Still have some issues to work on, but we try.
Yeah, and along those same lines, California now, fairly recently, in the last 5 years or so, now has a process outside of an individual department for the state to decertify police officers when they take certain actions that aren't acceptable. And so it wouldn't matter if a department wanted to hire them or not. They're decertified. They can't serve in this state as a police officer if they're decertified. Very controversial issue that had a recent election that was overwhelmingly passed. 68%, I think, was the rate. But years ago we passed Prop 47 in California.
Yes.
That lowered some of the consequences for certain things, theft, drugs, things like that. And there's a lot of people that feel that contributed to the increase in crime. We started seeing, masses of people going into malls like in San Francisco and just stealing and running out and jumping into cars and getting away. And, there's people that have contributed, said that contributed to homelessness and all these different things and kind of some consequences I don't think that the people that wrote Prop 47 ever intended, but drug courts and those sort of things. And then more recently, as a response to that, Prop 36 was put on the ballot that was overwhelmingly passed, 68%, I believe it was, that increases some of those penalties, still has, social service type of services for people. And then now the latest controversy is it has been funded, but some say not funded enough at the state level. So what's your take moving forward on Prop 36 and this sort of issue of how to address crime that some people feel is somewhat, to a certain extent, out of control?
So we need to have that trust and safety, and the people spoke. We voted for Prop 36, so we should implement it. Give people the confidence that we're going to move in a direction that provides them more safety. Let them know that they can trust that their public officials will be able to implement the policies that they've said, as you said, by overwhelming numbers, should be implemented. And unless it's unconstitutional, we should have elected officials who are trying to administer the new laws the way the public expected. And so you can't do public safety on the cheap. And if you try to do it half-heartedly, it's not going to work. And the worst part is you're going to lose the confidence and the trust of the people. And that's what you don't want, because that's when they overreact.
Right.
And that's what happens is oftentimes it's tough in that pendulum to get it right and right in that sweet spot. And so sometimes we go too far one way or too far the other way. And we have to give people the confidence that we know how to balance it. And I think that's what happens when these initiatives pass. People get frustrated. The carjackings, they wake up and they find their car's been burglarized. They find that people are rushing through the malls and just making off with stuff and nobody gets charged. You know, people lose confidence, and they spoke. And we need to make sure that we give them what they were expecting, the safety. And if we do that, they'll reward us with trust. But if we're not accountable, as I said before, that partnership is going to break.
Yeah, I think no matter where you live and no matter who your family is, everybody wants to be safe.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you live in this impoverished neighborhood, high crime, like everybody wants to be safe. They want their kids to be safe. They want their family to be safe.
And by the way, those same people that are probably doing some of that vandalizing, if somebody's trying to hurt them, guess what? They're going to call 911.
Yes. Yeah, that's the one consistent. So you mentioned this earlier. We, especially in California, we've seen large, huge protests in regards to immigration. One just yesterday in Los Angeles. Some that initially went on for days and days and days, and you'd see it incessantly on the news. The impetus for that is really the federal government's ICE and other agencies, the National Guard being taken over to conduct these activities, immigration activities in our cities. And as you mentioned earlier, it often puts local law enforcement in this bind. And as an example would be so maybe there's some ICE agents doing some sort of immigration enforcement, and a crowd starts getting disruptive and maybe assaulting them. And so the police are called. The local police could be Sacramento Police, LAPD, whatever. And so, a lot of these jurisdictions throughout California have, certain regulations about what they can and can't do with ICE. But now it's a matter of a fellow law enforcement officer is being assaulted or in danger. And now we're in the middle of this, and now we're trying to keep people safe, and the local law enforcement is now looked at as, to be quite frank, as doing immigration enforcement, which they're really not doing.
Yeah.
So as governor, how moving forward do you think we should deal with this? Because I don't get the impression that's going to stop tomorrow, right? So the local agencies, or even the state agencies, Highway Patrol oftentimes, are put in this situation where they're trying to keep the peace, trying to keep law enforcement agents safe, trying to keep the public safe, trying to keep the protesters safe. And again, it starts eroding that trust that many local agencies have worked really hard to build trust and legitimacy, and still have a ways to go, as you mentioned. So what can be done in California specifically for the situation that just is fraught with challenges?
Yeah, and I've reached out to folks in law enforcement on this, but here's what I would say is, I think as governor, one of the first things I would have done is I would have reached out to all of our law enforcement leadership, the chiefs, the sheriffs, the association leaders, and said, okay, how do we deal with this? Because we're going to be put in the middle of it. And what is the best thing we can do? I think one of the answers there is we, the leadership of law enforcement in California, want to have face-to-face with the federal leadership in law enforcement that's doing these activities, conducting these raids and so forth. We want to get a clear sense of what they're doing. And we want to convey a clear sense that we can't have them doing things that go beyond their federal reach. And I think they have gone overboard. They have overreached. And we have to make it very clear. You can't cross that line, because then you put us in a predicament where we as state and local law enforcement have to protect our communities. And it's a tough thing when what we're looking at is confronting federal law enforcement in order for us to protect our communities. Right. And so we need to get a straight line from them about what they are doing, what they will do, and how we can essentially, what the terms of engagement will be, because I don't believe you can continue to allow these federal agencies to overreach and to be engaging in activities which would not be permitted in a civilized society, in a constitutional government. You cannot be wearing a mask. You cannot be unidentified and profess that you're going to be doing law enforcement, because how do you then distinguish between? I heard there was some guy, a criminal obviously now, who went up to a woman and essentially said, I'm law enforcement, ICE law enforcement, and essentially raped her.
Right.
And how do you distinguish? So we can't allow it to happen. I think we need to move quickly, find the terms of engagement, but make it very clear. You step over your line, and now you have to deal with us, which is difficult, as you said, because now you're putting law enforcement in the middle. And I hate to say that, but if we don't stand up, they will roll all over us, and they will roll all over our local and state law enforcement if we don't stand up.
Well, and again, process is important,
That's
right?
it.
How you carry out business. And as chief, we always made it very clear that if a law enforcement agent calls for help and they're in danger, we are going to help. I don't care what they're doing.
That's right.
If they're being confronted and assaulted, we are going to respond, and we're going to try to keep the peace. And so whether we agree or don't agree with, the way they're doing something, if they're in danger, they're a fellow law enforcement officer, we're going to help.
For sure.
So
can I one last thing, Chief, on that?
Yeah.
So we just talked in terms of law enforcement. Can I just say something in terms of the community? Because remember, these incidents occur because feds are saying, hey, the people went overboard. They started to vandalize. They started to attack our agents, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what I would say. Most of these folks that are marching and protesting are peaceful. They're doing it to show support for immigrants and to try to protect them. But here you have some of these provocateurs who come in these crowds, and they are throwing rocks or bottles or vandalizing or burning vehicles. They are doing everything but helping these immigrant families. They're doing everything but helping these civil, peaceful protesters. And we, the community, have to stand up against them. Just as I said, our law enforcement has to stand up against federal law enforcement overreach. We, the people in these protests, have to stand up against these provocateurs who are willing to incite and create the havoc that lets the feds say they have no choice. Because if we don't do that, then it just snowballs. And I think if you're out there to do harm, stay home.
Right.
And if you see someone doing harm, videotape them as much as you videotape the federal ICE officers.
Yeah, which brings back memories of the protests we had here in Sacramento for years and years between Stephon Clark and George Floyd. Most of the protesters, especially our local ones, that the naturally growing protests, they were angry, they were upset, they were mad, they were shouting, they were blocking streets, but they weren't the ones that were trying to burn buildings down and damaging cars and doing those sort of things. But also, we took a lot of time, as we learned along the way. We made plenty of mistakes, but we learned along the way sometimes our actions can provoke some stuff. So we had to really think about how we responded, keep officers out of sight in certain circumstances, but close enough to respond if some, those sort of things, which I think some of the things we've seen recently provoke some of those. Not that's an excuse for somebody trying to burn a building down, but it's a fine balance of keeping a community safe, and 100% of the people are never going to be in agreement with you no matter what, especially in circumstances like that. Last question on Prop 47 and 36. I've heard some law enforcement leaders talk about some of the rules that have been implemented at various levels in California regarding local law enforcement cooperating with the federal agencies in regards to immigration, that some of that is what causes the federal agents to go to places like schools and things like this, where they could have gone to the jail or something like that. What are your thoughts on and I would imagine even the people that came up with those local rules did not anticipate that being the result, if that is the result. But what are your thoughts on the whole cooperation between local law enforcement and federal agencies regarding immigration. And I'll be the first to say, as police chief, you probably look on some news station, I repeatedly said we don't enforce immigration law. That is a federal responsibility. We want people to feel comfortable calling us no matter what, if it's a safety concern. But at the same time, we were going to cooperate if somebody's in danger or they needed our help. So thoughts on the whole issue of local agencies or state agencies, for that matter, cooperating in some form or fashion with the federal government in regards to immigration?
Yeah. First, this explanation or argument, excuse that the reason that you're seeing these unconstitutional raids and enforcement activities that are rounding up even citizens, that it's because we're not cooperating where we need to in the prisons and the jails and so forth. Rubbish. That's rubbish. There is no reason why you are running down and tackling a guy who's standing in the parking lot of Home Depot or taking out a guy who's picking up his daughter from school because you couldn't catch them in a jail. It's rubbish. That's not an excuse, and it just burns me when I hear that as the reason why ICE is being so aggressive, overly aggressive, unconstitutionally aggressive. But here's what I will say. As you said, and you know this because you were chief, we cooperate with federal immigration and law enforcement writ large all the time. In fact, when I was AG, I was suing the Trump administration for what they were trying to make the state do in terms of law enforcement. They were trying to deny us burn grants for cops on the beat because we weren't doing immigration with them, and we had to sue them, and we won because they were trying to deny us money for our police agencies because they didn't like what we were doing. But we won that case. But we cooperate all the time. At the same time that I was suing Trump, we were working with them day in, day out on organized crime interdiction,
right,
on sex trafficking, on drug interdiction. We were doing that all the time with ICE and all the rest. So you can work with them and still sue them. It's just that when they're going overboard, you say, wait, you can't go there. I'll go there with you here, but not there.
Right.
And so what we do in California is we say, federal agencies on immigration, you get to enforce. We don't. But don't expect us to do your business for you. And that's all that the state's laws say. And so that right now, these lawsuits, whether the federal government's suing us or we're suing the federal government, it's all about what the feds can require us to do. They cannot commandeer our resources and our agencies to do their work. They cannot force us to do federal law enforcement. And we won that. When I was AG, we won that kind of case. Right. So I think we're going to win it again. And simply what I'll say to you is that where we need to, we will work with them. So if there's some dangerous felon that we know is about to be released from prison, or was dangerous, obviously getting ready to be released, we do notify ICE. They get warning. What we don't do is then become the jailers for them when they say, hey,
hold them 10 extra days.
Hold them for an extra week until we can get there.
Right.
Now we're doing federal detention of that individual. We've given them notice. We've told them this guy is going to be released pretty soon. Be there to get him. That they don't come, that's their problem. That's their fault, not our fault. We have given them notice. And so these excuses that they're coming up with just they don't fly. And I think it's rubbish when they make these arguments. But I do believe, and I think you'll agree with this, when you are in charge with enforcing law and providing public safety, you're going to do everything you can to make sure that's the case. And that includes making sure someone who doesn't have documents to be in this country and is a dangerous individual doesn't just go back on the streets.
Yeah. I just think that's going to continue, or at least it appears that it's going to continue to be a challenge for a lot of work that a lot of agencies have worked really hard with their communities to build legitimacy and all that. It's a big challenge to that moving forward. This rub between the federal agencies and the local agencies, because again, the local agencies, they live there. They're there every day.
Yeah.
They gotta. Them and the community have to see and work with each other tomorrow. Whereas a lot of times the federal agency or agent, they're in here and they're out.
Yeah.
So
here today, gone tomorrow. But
I think that's a challenge that that the governor and many others will have to continue to try to find what works best, because, as you mentioned earlier, without trust and legitimacy, it's really hard to keep communities safe.
And Chief, you know this. How do you encourage that next young man or woman to want to become a police officer?
Right.
And we have to make it so that they see it as rewarding to be public safety officers. And this is making it very tough.
Yeah.
All of these things make it very tough. And
It was already tough.
it was already, that's right. It
Before
was
that,
already tough. And again, we lead the nation when it comes to trying to do it the right way. And so I think when someone is willing to go to the academy, they're essentially saying, I know the standard's going to be pretty high, but I want to do this. And we should elevate those folks who want to give service that way.
So last question. This is a huge question. So, I don't think we're going to solve anything this large in this conversation, but I'm curious, climate change, all things climate change, whether it's water, accessibility or water period, the wildfires, electric vehicles. California has tended to be at the forefront of that conversation. I know people that live, I don't live in a rural area, but I have friends that have lived in a rural area over the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 5 years. Several friends have got phone calls from their insurance company that says, we will no longer insure you because of fire hazards and all that. Insurance rates are going up. Just with everything else, affordability-wise, insurance is going up. All these things are happening under the realm of climate change. Just in general, what are your thoughts on this? The whole thing, climate change related to water, wildfires, cars, just in general, what should we be thinking about as Californians, and as governor, what would be some of your priorities or thoughts in regards to that? And I know it's a big question, but I'm just curious in general, what are your thoughts?
Climate change, it's here, it's real, and we got to stay ahead of it, and that's what California has tried to do. Look at what's happening in Texas right now, where more than 100 people have now died.
Goes up every day, the number.
A fourth of them are children. And 160 or so or more are still missing. You got to be ready. And climate change is, no one can deny it now. And we have to be ready. And California has been good about trying to be ahead of it. Here's the only issue I will mention, whether it's water, or it's how we deal with housing. We have to make sure everyone can come along when we say, let's move. And here's where I think it's become clear that California, as ambitious as it has been, as innovative as it has been, has sometimes moved a little faster than the population can follow. We've essentially gotten ahead of our skis. And for example, when you hear that we need to start moving away from fossil fuel, natural gas, for example, and people say, well, it's really time for us to change our gas stoves to electric stoves. Yeah, that makes sense if you want to cut back on fossil fuels. But for the guy who's barely trying to buy the house, and, and they got a gas stove,
more cost.
More cost. Are they thinking, I'm going to spend another several $100s to buy a new stove? But not because my stove doesn't work. It's because we're going to switch over. We get ahead of the people. And while I think everyone would say, as soon as I can afford to do that, maybe that's something I'll do. But we have to make it so that they can afford to join us in this effort. And so I have no doubt, and certainly if I'm governor, we will not retract. We will not recede in our efforts to be ahead of the game. But we're going to bring the team with us. We're not going to say that there's a goal line and think I can get there without my 10 other men on the offensive line and my receiver. You score that touchdown, you need the full team to score that touchdown. And sometimes I think California's innovators forget to bring the team with them to score that touchdown.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the whole, what real people are thinking when some of these things are discussed. And it just reminded me again of I try to be tough like my mom was, right? When I was growing up, again, to this whole affordability thing. So when I first got my driver's license, I drove my mom's car whenever she wasn't driving it, which wasn't often.
Yeah.
But I had to put gas in it. I had to pay my own insurance. And now I look at how much the insurance costs for each one of my daughters. They both have part-time. One of my daughters has 2 part-time jobs and goes to college at the same time. They could not afford the insurance. It would be their whole entire check. And one time I'm putting gas in their car and I'm thinking, they got little jobs now. It's about time they start paying their gas like I did. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at the gas bill. That would be 2 weeks of their pay just to put gas for 1 week. So I'm thinking what my mom made me do to be responsible and to learn the value of money and all these things. Literally, they'd be working to put gas in their car, and they couldn't afford their insurance. That they don't make enough money to pay the insurance, and so, there's things that we knew when we were growing up that our parents, made us do that forged who we were that you literally can't even do. So we find other ways to do it, but that whole affordability thing I think is critical, especially in places like California. Although I laugh because people always say, people are leaving California in droves. I'm like, well, I get on the freeway every day. It doesn't feel like people left in droves. Yeah. So lastly, if somebody is inspired by some of the things that you have said today and either want more information or want to support the things you've said, how can they learn more, contribute? How can they support what you're doing?
Well, first, I hope they'll stay in touch with you, and then you can let them know where I am. But otherwise, they can just go to JavierBecerra2026.com and look me up there. And I guarantee you there are many ways they can track me down if they don't use that website. But we'll be around. We'll be around, and we're going to deal with this affordability crisis. We're going to make it so that your daughters can afford to pay for their
I'd appreciate that.
Auto insurance.
Get out of my pockets.
Yeah, we want that construction worker and that clerical worker today to believe that they're going to be able to buy that house, send their kids to college or the military, and then retire in dignity. That's what California is about. And people will still come. California's got the resources and the beauty and the opportunity. They will come. We just got to make it so that as we prosper, that means the big we, not just a few we. Everybody we.
Well, I'll tell you, I've lived here my whole life. I have absolutely zero desire to leave, even though we have challenges. So you can still love a place and still think we can be better. And I think that's what America's about.
That's right. Challenges. That's why we love it, because it has challenges. We're there to meet them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I think it's been very helpful for people to hear your opinions. But even more so, thank you. Regardless of where people's views are, you have spent your entire life serving our country, our state, our communities. And so that's getting more and more challenging by the day for people to do that. And you have chosen to spend your entire life, which means your family has chosen to spend their entire life doing the same thing. So thank you for that, and I appreciate you and your time.